Once upon a time, I was a bit transphobic. I wasn't mean to trans people, didn't harass or bully them online. I mostly didn't see them as much of an actual threat, and I basically kept to myself about it. However, I was still relatively judgy of trans people, quietly scrutinizing their behavior to myself, wondering things like, why would you do that? Why would a man mutilate his genitalia to look like a girl? Basically, I thought of trans people either as individuals who wanted to masquerade as the opposite sex, or as people who are just batshit fucking crazy and delusional. And there was this one time when I was working the front counter at my job that this woman walked in, and I immediately got all excited, happy to have a pretty lady to talk to. But a moment later, I was questioning just how pretty she actually was. Because as she got closer, I started to think that there was something weird looking about her, and it wasn't in a good way. I found it thoroughly unattractive. Eventually, they got close enough for me to make out the texture of their chin, and it looked like they had shaved some facial hair off a couple of days ago or so, but it was on its way back. And when they spoke, a very manly, masculine voice came out, like they weren't even trying to sound like a girl. Anyway, the whole thing shook me to my core. Like, I was literally shaking with the realization that this woman I was so excited to talk to turned out not to be the woman I thought. So yeah, that reaction was clearly a bit transphobic. But one day, people all over the internet started getting fussy about that Sex Spectrum episode of Bill Nye Saves the World, and I decided to watch it for myself, to see what all the commotion was about. Based on what people had to say about it, I wouldn't have been surprised if Bill Nye had said a bunch of stuff that made him look like an idiot. But he didn't. Damn near everything he said made perfect sense to me. And I noticed that the people who were so upset with him had a tendency to miss the point or say things that were clearly just short-sighted or downright fallacious. So I did some additional research, checking out scholarly science lectures and documentaries, and this research revealed to me that while Bill Nye's presentation wasn't perfect, it was mostly valid and on the right track. So, I made a video called Bill Nye Was Right About the Sex Spectrum, and the transphobes did not like that. But there also was a complete failure to debunk any of my points. There was this tendency for people with a lower level of education to try and school me on the topic, even though I was the one who was using university-level sources. Needless to say, that did not work in their favor. I mean, it would be like if a high school graduate went on to attend university-level courses, only to conclude that all the new stuff they're being taught can't be right because it's not what they learned back in high school, which of course is a lower level of education compared to a university. This is how the transphobic community looks when I present them with university-level education material, and they combat me with shit they learned while attending K through 12. Given how objective I've been with this topic, and how actual research has changed the way I see transgenders, it's been a little concerning that exposing others to the same information that changed my mind is, for the most part, not changing their minds. Some of the reactions to this information have been similar to my own. But for the most part, people seem to think I'm wrong because this isn't what mommy and daddy taught them as kids, or they didn't learn it at a low level of education. So, I've had to find new ways to repackage the information and clarify things for people to put in perspective that they just simply didn't get the best education available on this stuff back when they were kids. Now, don't get me wrong. This is not to imply that all trans and non-binary people have a university level of education. They do not. And you will find that I approach this subject quite differently from how many of them will approach it. Many activists like to focus heavily on the semantical distinction between biological sex and gender. And while I think there's a place for that, and compelling arguments to be made with that approach, by itself, it can give the false impression that trans and non-binary people are just delusional and think they're some sex other than what they actually are. We will often hear transphobes say things like, Feeling like something doesn't mean you are that thing biologically. But what the university-level science education reveals is that biological sex can be broken down into components, including but not necessarily limited to genotypic sex, phenotypic sex, and brain sex. Genotype has to do with chromosomes, and phenotype has to do with genitalia, as well as some other things. And of course, brain type has to do with the brain. The TERFs will claim that brain sex has been debunked, but that's a lie. Yes, many attempts at debunking it exist online, but in their attempts to debunk it, they have actually confirmed it. Now, that being said, while genotype, phenotype, and brain type will all usually agree on what an individual's biological sex is, this is not the case in trans, intersex, or non-binary people. In fact, trans and non-binary people have been found to have gender identities that correspond to their brain sex. Not that every fiber of a trans woman's brain is like a female brain, but MRI scans, autopsies, and other kinds of research have found parallels between the brains of trans and cisgender women that mostly do not exist between trans women and cisgender men. This is the kind of information I presented in my most recent video titled Transphobe Matt Walsh Looked Stupid on Dr. Phil's Show. But because I titled the video that way, Matt's loyal white knights came into my comments section to distort the message of my video. A lot of people acted like I was trying to make the case that Matt's debate opponents had rock-solid arguments and completely destroyed him. But while I felt his opponents made some valid points, I take a different approach than they do, and I explained this in the video. I used my own points to combat what Matt was saying. So I wasn't trying to say that Matt's debate opponents made him look stupid. I'm saying Matt made himself look stupid on Dr. Phil's show. That is, he looked stupid to me as someone who's actually been researching the neuroscience of trans and non-binary people. As the guy that's actually watching the scholarly science lectures and documentaries, getting a university level of education on these topics, Matt's less advanced education was not a good look for him on that debate stage. Now, if your education level is as low a grade as Matt's, I understand why he looked to you like he was dominating, and why it looked like he was right and everyone else was wrong. But back in the real world, even though his debate opponents could have made better arguments, Matt's understanding of trans and non-binary people is just simply wrong. These are not people who are delusional or masquerading as the opposite sex. They are people that were born different. Their gender identity corresponds to their brain sex.
Well, human sexuality and how it's expressed in particular cultures is a very, very complicated subject. Biologists, however, generally break it down into various categories, and they're obviously interrelated in most individuals. But these categories would include genotypic sex. So genotypic sex is determined by the inheritance of either two X's or an X and a Y chromosome. The next type of category of sex that biologists generally make is phenotypic sex. And this is determined by the development of internal and external genitalia. So obviously, genotypic sex and phenotypic sex are generally related. I have to tell you, however, there are disorders in which, for one reason or another, genotypic sex and phenotypic sex are not the same. So they don't always occur normally together. And in human beings, we also have something else, and that's called gender identification. And this is determined by the subjective experience or perception of one's own sex. So the latter is a construct created by the brain related to one's perceived sexual identity. So this is a construct created by the individual related to which sex they identify with. Now, what we have found out in neuroscience, and we think that gender identification is more related to this, neuroscience has in fact found another category. It's revealed another category of sex called brain sex. And brain sex means that the actual structural and thus likely to be functional, differences in the way brains are organized in male and female may in fact relate to differences in how males and females relate to their environment and also gender identification. The differentiation into two forms, so we say a male and a female form, is referred to as sexual dimorphism of the brain. So what does it mean to say that a nucleus or an area of the brain is sexually dimorphic? Well, what it means is that somehow an individual nucleus or a structure is different in the size, the number, or the density of neurons. So a particular area may be different in males and females depending on the number of neurons found in that area. An area is sexually dimorphic if the connections between it and another area are different between males and females. Or you could have a difference in the expression of particular molecules and receptors, for example, in different structures of the brain in males and females. What is important here is this. There's a lot of variability in every one of our brains, so all of our brains aren't exactly the same. So if we looked in any structure, if we looked at a group of females, for example, there'd be a certain amount of variation in that structure among that group of females. If we looked in males, the same would be true. So when we're talking about sexual dimorphism, we're saying that the differences between males and females are much greater than the differences that exist within either of the groups. So these structures are very different enough that in some cases, any trained scientist could immediately look at a section of the brain through particular areas and would be able to tell you whether that section came from the brain of a male or the brain of a female. So we're talking about pretty big differences here.
Our brains are not basically the same. You can tell looking at brains whether or not they belong to a male or a female 80% of the time.
The precursor genitals transform into either female or male during the first trimester of pregnancy. The precursor brains, on the other hand, transform into female or male during the second trimester of pregnancy. So the current working model is that a unique mix in my mom's womb caused the precursor genitals to transform one way, but the precursor brains to transform the other way.
And this does happen. If those little gonads don't produce enough testosterone, so there isn't enough to get into the brain and thereby be converted within certain groups of neurons into estradiol, that male will develop a female brain. In females, in female fetuses, if for some reason the mother is producing a high level of androgens in her bloodstream, if the mother is exposed to certain kinds of steroids, if the mother takes particular drugs like barbiturates during pregnancy, or we now know if the mother is exposed to high levels of pesticides, all of these things will masculinize female brains. So that means that a female fetus whose mother is exposed to certain things, that fetus will be exposed to androgen, that will in fact masculinize her brain. Now, the brain becomes sexually dimorphic during a critical period or window of time. For different kinds of things that occur developmentally, there are different critical periods. So depending on what we're talking about, it could be a different critical period of time. And in this case, the critical period for humans for sexual dimorphism of the brain occurs before birth. So that means that from that point on, brain sex is determined. There is nothing that can change it. Brain sex cannot be changed, and it's determined before birth, at least in human beings. The critical period for sexual dimorphism in the rat is postnatal, so it occurs after birth. And this means that as scientists, we can manipulate the hormonal environment during the critical period much easier than we could if it occurred in utero. So rats are a wonderful model for this. They're also a wonderful model because the behavior of rats is very sexually dimorphic. So that means adult male rats engage in mounting behavior and certain kinds of behaviors that are very different than adult females. Female rats, when they're sexually excited, exhibit something called lordosis, which means the rear part of the body moves up and their tail moves out of the way. And female rats also engage in nest building activity. So you have an animal in which its adult behavior is also very clearly dimorphic. So you can watch their behavior very carefully. And when you manipulate them, or you manipulate this critical period, you can see what happens or how this plays out. So that's it. They're very, very good model for studying this. So what happens if we manipulate the hormonal environment of a male or a female rat during their critical period right after birth, when their brains are going to become sexually dimorphic? Note that the animals that we manipulate, we can determine what their genotypic and obviously phenotypic sex are. So let's imagine that we take a female rat pup and we give them testosterone during the critical period. Now, these animals are females genotypically and phenotypically. If we manipulate by giving testosterone during that critical period and never give testosterone again, as adults, those females engage in mounting behavior. They act as males, not as females. If we take little male pups and we castrate them during the critical period. Now remember, it's the critical period that's important, not if you do anything any other time, but that critical period. If you castrate little male pups during their critical period, as adults, they show lordosis when they're approached by males, and they also engage in nesting building or nesting behavior. So they act consistent with their brain sex.
A region of the brain that shows a sex difference in its average size. Don't even worry about the name of this. It's called the bed nucleus of the striae terminalis. It's where the amygdala begins to send its projection into the hypothalamus. Another one to those gender differences, there's one type of neuron in there with a certain type of neurotransmitter where very, very reliably it is about twice the size in males than in females. Sufficiently so that even in human brains you could pretty confidently determine the sex of somebody by seeing the number of these neurons. You'll see I'm not even saying the name of the neurotransmitter, it's irrelevant. It's just another one of those differences, a dimorphism in a region of the brain, a really, really reliable one. And this was a study done by some superb neuroanatomists looking at transsexuals. And what they showed was very interesting, which was very, very reliably and a very powerful effect what you would see in their large sample size of transsexuals' brains post-mortem was people would have this part of the brain the size not of their sex that they were born with, but rather of the sex they insisted they always actually were. Wow. Immediate questions one must ask. Okay, well maybe this is due to the fact that when people change gender, transsexual procedures, there's a whole lot of hormones involved, and maybe that's doing something to this part of the brain. Critical control that they had was this was looking both at transsexuals who had made gender changes and those who went to their deathbed saying, this is not the sex that I am, I got the wrong body, but never made the change. It wasn't a function of having actually gone through the transition and the endocrine manipulations with it. Another control they had, which was looking at men who would get a certain type of testicular cancer where they would have to be treated with certain feminizing hormones. In other words, very similar to some of the endocrine treatments of male to female transgendered individuals, and post-mortem, you didn't see the changes there. It has nothing to do with the hormones. It had to do with the person insisting from day one that they got the wrong body. And this was a landmark study, fabulously well done and controlled and replicated once since then, showing that what transsexualism used to be thought of is that people who think that they're a different gender than they actually are. What this study suggests is what transsexualism is about is people who got the wrong gendered body. And these are people who are chromosomally of one sex. In terms of their gonads, they're of that sex. In terms of their hormones, they're of that sex. In terms of their genitalia and their secondary sexual characteristics, they are of that sex. But they are insisting that's not who I really am. This part of the brain agrees with them.
So you think it's a delusion? Someone is self-delusional?
Yeah, I think it's delusion. It could be mental illness.
I had a conversation with your mother before you came out, and she said, what is this that my son thinks he wants to be a woman? And I said, well, interestingly, there's a very serious study by the Cleveland Clinic that has done MRI scans on transgender persons that has determined that if you are a transgender woman, that your brain is much more aligned functionally with a straight female than it is with a male. What I was telling you is that I was explaining to her that this is not a mental illness, that there's actually differences within the body for someone that feels the way you do. It's not just in your mind.
In case you guys missed it, even though Dr. Phil's a Republican, the science denier mother there accused him of pushing a liberal agenda because he pointed out that the science demonstrates that being trans isn't a mental illness. This is exactly what many of Matt Walsh's white knights did in my comment section. Since the brain science isn't on their side, they resort to unsubstantiated political conspiracy theories.